All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest webinar in our 5 series from Gunnercooke. This one is called 5 Quick Wins to Get Your Business Ready for Gender Pay Gap Reporting. My name's Simon Horsfield. I'm an employment law partner here at Gunnercooke and a gender pay gap expert. And I can see from the number of people who have dialed into this webinar that it's a hot topic for people, and it's obviously generating quite a bit of interest. So let's get going. Just in terms of housekeeping, there is a facility to raise questions on your dashboard. Please feel free to use that. What I propose, though, is that we'll go through the presentation and then mop up any questions at the end. We should just be half an hour or so. The session will be recorded. It will be available on our website to listen again to, and you can always forward that link to any colleagues or people in your network who you think would benefit from it. Okay, so we're going to start just by quickly recapping on the law, because this is all driven by a legal requirement. And the headline point is that the deadline for reporting on your gender pay gap in your organisation is April of next year. And the obligation applies to any employer with 250 or more employees on the snapshot date that is being reported on. And that snapshot date, the first one, we have to look back to the 5th of April this year, so 5th April 2017. And we publish our report by the 4th of April next year. Now, in terms of those 250 employees, it's useful just to remind ourselves that this is looked at on a company-by-company basis. So if you are part of a group of companies, then you don't aggregate across the group, you just look at it employer by employer. And each company in the group has to publish its own report. You can't just get away with one group report covering all of the group companies. Now, when we look at that 250 threshold, it's important to bear in mind that the definition of employees, which flows from the Equality Act, is a wide definition. And actually, it includes people working under a contract of employment or any contract personally to do work for you. So it's much wider than the definition that we are used to in, for example, the Employment Rights Act and so on. And because of that, it means that potentially we have to factor in casual staff, partners in an LLP if they aren't genuinely self-employed. In the original draft of the regulations, it was made clear that only employees ordinarily working in Great Britain were in scope. That didn't appear in the final version, so now technically overseas employees who are employed by the UK company are included when you have to look at your threshold. So this means we've got to look carefully at who's in scope when deciding whether or not we meet the threshold, and of course when considering whose pay data we have to look at. Now, in terms of how we calculate the pay gap, what we are essentially reporting on is the difference between average pay for males in an organisation and the average pay for females. And we actually have to report both the mean and the median, mean being the average, median being the midpoint in the range. So we can express this average as a formula, and this is the formula that the regulations themselves use, this A minus B divided by A times 100. A is the average male pay, B is the average female pay as an hourly rate. So just to put some context to that, if you review pay across your organisation and identify that the average male is paid £10, the average female is paid £8, then 10 minus 8 would give you 2. Divide that by 10 and times it by 100, and you would have a gender pay gap in your organisation standing at 20%. And the pay gap is always expressed as a percentage. And remember that pay for these purposes isn't just basic pay. It also includes any allowances that you offer, any holiday pay that's paid, shift premium pay, and bonus pay, if it happens to have been paid in that relevant pay reference period. So this makes calculating and working out what constitutes pay for the purposes of your pay gap report a slightly more complicated exercise than it might otherwise have been. To further complicate things, other payments that might have been paid in that pay reference period are expressly excluded, the biggest one of those being overtime. So whereas shift premium pay is included, any overtime payment is excluded. Then termination payments, payments in lieu of holidays, benefits in kind, expenses, things like that are also excluded. Now, as well as publishing our gender pay gap, we also have to publish information about our gender bonus gap based on mean and median bonuses paid to males and females in the 12 months preceding the pay reference period. So if the pay reference period is April 2017, that means we need to look 12 months back from there. So this is getting into really historic pay data to work out what bonuses have been paid in the organisation during that period. And bonuses include cash and non-cash amounts. And non-cash amounts there would cover things like long-term incentive payments, share-based incentive plans, and so on. That gets a little bit complicated because when do you deem a share-based incentive actually to be paid? And we've been given some helpful clarification on that non-cash amounts are deemed paid at the time and in the amount in respect of which they give rise to taxable earnings income. And that will vary depending on the nature of the incentive that you're looking at. It's also been clarified that deferred bonuses won't count. They don't have to be reported on until the time when they are actually paid. So if someone is given a bonus award of £10,000, of which £3,000 is deferred, then you would only actually report on the £7,000 and you would pick up the deferred element later when it's actually paid. Now, as well as reporting on the pay gap and the bonus gap, we will also have to be publishing details of the proportion of men and women in our organisation across 4 pay bands, known as the pay quartiles. And this information, in some ways, is the most telling bit of what we have to report on, because it shows where women are concentrated in the organisation compared with men. And when you look at this information when it's published, it very quickly helps you to identify where there might be glass ceilings within an organisation. If you think about it, if in your top quartile you have predominantly or exclusively men, then that might suggest or be indicative of a glass ceiling in that organisation that's stopping women getting beyond a certain point. The information has to be published on your website, and you must keep a record of it on there for 3 years. So you can see that over time we will be building up a history of pay data, and people will be able to view that and see how your organisation is progressing in terms of any attempt to narrow the pay gap. As well as this, we also have to upload the information onto a government website. I updated these slides yesterday to record the fact that 351 employers had reported on their pay data on that government website. I checked it just before coming on this webinar. It now stands at 364. So you can see that all the time now people are starting to think about the fact that they need to get this information uploaded because the clock is ticking. But of course, 364, there must be, I'm sure I've seen a statistic that says there's over 10,000 employers that would be in scope to report. So you can see we've still got a long way to go. Now, there's not currently any requirement to include this information in your annual report, but I suspect that might change at some point. And as we've said, we've got to publish the information on an annual basis, and each year we have to publish it within 12 months of the relevant snapshot date. So in terms of the 5th of April 2017 snapshot date, which was the first one, we have until the 4th of April 2018. Now, as well as publishing the information on your website, you can include an accompanying narrative. And from what I can see, most employers are doing that, and that makes sense because that allows you to tell a bit more of a story than just presenting the stark data. Okay, so that, I think, is all I wanted to say in terms of the legal position, and really is all just about setting the scene. And what I wanted to move on to now was the quick wins as I see them. 5 things that we can all be doing to make this process as painless as possible and also hopefully as positive as possible for the business. Oh, sorry, before that, I just had one more slide I was going to mention. You may well be sitting there thinking, well, this is all well and good, but what happens if we don't comply with this obligation? And the government had a choice here, and they actually decided to make it a voluntary scheme in the sense that there is no civil enforcement regime. So you can't be fined or prosecuted in any sense for not disclosing your pay data. The Equality and Human Rights Commission has indicated they might well take enforcement action. That remains to be seen. But I think the bigger issue here is that the government has said it will run periodic checks to review the extent to which employers are complying with this obligation. And I think there is the serious potential for sanctions to be introduced if these voluntary measures aren't seen to be working. And I suspect that the Equality and Human Rights Commission will be lobbying hard for that. You should also know that the information that is published is available on that government website for anyone to see, and that they intend to publish details of gender pay gaps on a sector-by-sector basis. There was even mention of a list of worst offenders being made public. I think that's been abandoned, but the information will be there for all to see anyway. And my sense is that employees, prospective employees, as well as journalists, potentially your customers, are likely to want to view this information as part of their due diligence on you as an organisation. So as I say, that's why this stuff is serious, and that's why we need to understand the legal position. But let's move on to look at the quick wins. And quick win number 1 is probably a statement of the blindingly obvious, but I think it is worth stating anyway, and that is know the law. Because this reporting obligation, as that sort of 10, 12-minute introduction has made clear, isn't quite as straightforward as it sounds. And what you really need to know is that whoever is collating your pay data knows that law inside out. They should really have a copy of the gender pay gap reporting regulations in front of them. They should have access to the relevant guidance, particularly when it comes to identifying which employees do we include in these calculations, what does actually constitute pay, how do we calculate these bonuses, and so on. So I think that's really important. But I think it goes beyond that. I think it's also making sure at a high level that the board understands what this legal obligation is and appreciates just the significance of this pay data being made public and how people are going to be able to use that to find out information about what sort of an organisation yours is. And I've said there, seek external help if required. I think it's one of those areas where actually, whether it's lawyers, accountants, consultants, we are all there to provide help and give clarity on this issue, and there's no shame in taking that advice. Okay, quick win number 2 is a very strong recommendation from me to start crunching some numbers now. It would seem from the 364 or so that we've got who've as yet published their data, that a number of people may well not even have started to look at their pay data yet. If you haven't looked at your pay data, then using that Donald Rumsfeld phrase, you have a known unknown. You know it exists, but you don't know what it is. And those kind of unknowns are the ones that scare me the most, because I know they're there, but I'm just burying my head in the sand and not doing anything about them. So I think it's time to grasp that nettle or eat that frog and find out what your data is actually telling you about your business. And I think it's advisable not to leave it to the last minute. I think you need to find out how the land lies now, because you might actually be pleasantly surprised. I know one of my clients, engineering sector client, fairly heavily male-dominated environment, was very surprised when they ran their data and found there wasn't actually much of a pay gap at all. So that's just a quick story to encourage people. But the point is, there's a lot of information to be found out, and it's potentially going to take you longer than you realise to understand the position correctly. So leaving it to the last moment really isn't an option as far as I'm concerned. And of course, if your data now reveals a gap that is bigger than you hoped for, you have time now to start to think about how you are going to communicate and manage that message before ultimately publishing, and you could leave it as late as April to publish. There's no advantage to publishing early, but at least you get time to get your story straight and think about what you're going to do if you want to close that gap. In terms of the time it's going to take to obtain that data, one point I would make, speaking to clients, they tell me that most HR systems aren't geared up just to provide this information at a touch of a button. So it is a manual process, it is labour intensive. You might not even have the resource in-house to deal with this, in which case think about going external to an HR analyst, consultant, for example, because they will be able to just churn through that data really efficiently. Quick win number 3 is do some benchmarking, because my view is that in isolation, just looking at your own organisation's pay data won't really tell you that much. What I think you need to know in order to work out how you're going to present this information and what story you want to tell is how your pay data, your pay gap, compares to other organisations, particularly those in your sector, because they are your competitors, really, whether it's competing for employees or competing for customers. So you want to know how you compare with them. And in terms of your benchmarking options, I think the one obvious route is to have a look at that government website where the pay information, the pay reports are published. And I've included the link on the slides there. But it's very easy to find as a Google search. Just searching for pay gap reporting throws up that as one of the first 6 sites to visit. If you haven't got the time or the inclination to do that work yourself, then you could certainly ask your professional advisors for their experience of what other employers are doing in terms of a pay gap and how they are positioned. Certainly from my experience working with clients in a number of different sectors, it certainly seems to me that, for example, within financial services, if you break it down into insurance and insurance broking in particular, there is an issue there, and the sector, the industry recognises that, and as an industry is taking steps to try and address that. But that's the benefit of the experience that your professional advisors can give you when it comes to benchmarking where you are against others in your sector. If you really want to drill down into the detail, there are specialist reward consultancies out there who you could instruct, who will be able to produce a report for you and give you information that will enable you to make a truly informed decision. So that might be something you want to think about doing. And as I say, the reason really for doing this is so that you can properly think about your pay gap story. And that leads me on to quick win number 4, which really does depend on you having gone through all of that the processes that we've mentioned already. because it assumes you now have your pay data. But I think then what you should be doing is setting your objectives, deciding what response your business wants to make. And it might be that you are perfectly happy with your gap, that you're not an outlier statistically compared with others in your sector, and that's fine. You're happy just to keep on doing what you're doing. That's great, and that's fine. But most employers that I'm speaking to want to be seen to be doing something to narrow the gap. And there are various reasons for that, which we'll come on to. But if you want to narrow the gap, I would suggest you need to identify some SMART objectives. SMART, obviously the specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. I think it might be very noble and lofty ambition to eradicate the gender pay gap altogether in your business, but that on its own isn't going to be enough to give you anything to work to. You need to be specific in terms of what you are going to achieve over what time frame. And I think this is critical, this next point in this process. We really need board level buy-in if we're going to do anything in terms of setting objectives to close a pay gap. And we don't just need the board to buy into closing the gap, we need them to commit to a journey, because there are no quick fixes here as far as I'm concerned. It isn't just as simple as paying women more in your organisation. It's not even really an equal pay issue that causes the pay gap in most cases. And because of this, I think we need to be thinking about a board sponsor. I think we might need to set up a project team. We may even need to engage external support to give this project some real impetus and enable it to get off the ground. It's going to have to involve lots of working parties and working groups and stakeholder meetings and all that stuff that you would do as with any other transformation program. And that's how I see any attempt to close the pay gap in an organisation. It's a large-scale transformation program, and we should be approaching it with that degree of gravity and seriousness, I would suggest. I do think we also need to be realistic. A lot of the reports that I'm reading, and when you go into people's websites and see the reports that they've published on their website, talk about eradicating the pay gap altogether in their business. And I think that's great, and I think that should be everyone's ultimate aim. But we also need to be realistic that there are some things we can't do much to change, because some of the issues will be organisational specific and we can deal with those, but others may well be societal. So, for example, it is acknowledged that within our society there is a lack of women in STEM roles, so science, technology, engineering, manufacturing, and therefore there will inevitably be a smaller pool of women, and proportionately, therefore, fewer will make it into that upper pay quartile, and that is going to have a bearing on any pay gap report that you publish. And there's not a great deal you can do about that. You can only contribute and support to wider society initiatives to promote women in STEM roles. And there will be other examples of that you can think of. And so I think it's important that we acknowledge those things in the reports that we publish on our website, in the commentary, and say we are doing our bit, and we will support any wider initiatives and contribute to those accordingly. So we then come on to our communications, and the main communication is going to be the pay report that you publish on your website, because that's your opportunity to have your say. But I think we need to think broader than just the report itself on the website, because if we think about who our audience is for this information about pay gap, we've obviously got our employees, we've got our prospective employees. Employees will want to know that they are employed in an environment where women are valued as much as men. That's the kind of take that people seem to be putting on this. Prospective employees will potentially be looking at this data to say, do I really want to work for that organisation? Shareholders and investors will want to know that actually, as particularly with investors, as part of their due diligence, I suspect that this question will come up more and more. Where does the business stand in terms of pay gap? Because one thing's for sure, if we've got happy, engaged employees, that is there's a huge link between that and the customer service and productivity of the business. So for me, a wide pay gap is going to be indicative of a business that's potentially underperforming or has disengaged employees, which would be an area of concern for shareholders and investors. In terms of the general public and customers, I think we are more and more seeing consumers taking an interest in these kind of issues, the kind of social responsibility side. They want to buy ethically. I suspect we'll start to see, in a business-to-business sense, questions around gender pay gap featuring as part of tendering exercises and so on and so forth. So you can see how it can have that wider sort of public and business-to-business type dimension to it. Competition will certainly be interested to know where you stand. They will, as much as you'll be checking out their data, they will be checking out your data and seeing how they can potentially use that against you, or looking to narrow the gap between you and them. So all of those are the different audiences, I think, that we need to have in mind when we're thinking about our communications, and we need to think, what are we going to tell people and when are we actually going to communicate this? As I've said, starting point, not in terms of time, but in terms of what you're going to be working on for your communication, will be the information that goes into your website report. I think you should consider whether to produce the accompanying detail and story, and if so, how much detail to go into. Of those 364 employers who've already published information on the government side, I've looked at a good percentage of those individual companies' websites, and they are all putting a certain level of detail. Some go much deeper into the detail than others, but they're all telling some sort of story about where they want to get to with their pay gap. So I think really that seems to be the standard approach. And actually, you can follow the links on the government website to those individual company website reports. It's really easy. You just click on a link and it takes you, and that will give you ideas and help you to decide on the best approach for your business. Do you want lots of narrative, or do you want it very picture oriented and information displayed graphically with pie charts, or how are you going to present that information? And it all fits into your corporate style and so on. Now, my view is, in advance of publishing that information on the website, you should really be thinking about how you're going to share it with your workforce and your other key stakeholders. The last thing you want is them just stumbling across that information on your website. And I think as part of that project planning that we were talking about before, it's really important to be upfront about the information, to be upfront about your aims and objectives, and to seek feedback from your key stakeholders, especially employees, on steps that can be put in place to help to close this gap. I think if there is bad news, if it is a larger than expected gap, then you should think now about engaging with PR communications experts to consider how best to managing that messaging. And really the key, it seems to me, there is focusing on the positive steps that you're going to be taking, all the things that you will do to try to narrow this gap in the future. So those are the 5 quick wins that I've identified. I do hope you've found those useful. I'm just going to have a look and see if we've had any questions as we've gone along, and I'm pleased to say that there haven't been. I'm happy to just leave the webinar running for another minute or so if you want to drop any questions in, but if not, that's fine. My contact details were on the first slide, or contact your usual gunnercooke advisor. I should just say now before we close, look out for details of the next webinar in the 5 series. It's another employment-related one. My very talented colleague Rebecca Davidson is going to be talking on 5 top tips for negotiating terms of departure with senior executives, and further information will be coming out about that one. But in the absence of any questions at this stage, we may just have had one here. I was about to close it down. The question is, are we able to have a copy of the slides? Yeah, that's not a problem at all, and obviously the webinar audio file itself will be available to listen to again on the website. But yeah, I'll get some slides out to you, Phil, that's fine. Good, I'm going to close it there, and thank you all for attending.